And I want to begin my questioning on something you raised, which I think it bears further discussion, because no one here, I think, is against competition. You make an excellent point. But I would think, having been through this process myself, both as an owner and as a bidder, one of the difficulties that I always faced was knowing what the rules were in advance. That if I was going to bid on anything, whether it be a contract, a piece of land, a building, I wanted to know if I was in a reverse auction. I want to know how many rounds of bidding there would be. I want to know if there would be multiple best and last offers. Because if I ended up with the rules changing as I got into the process, over the long term, it has a chilling effect. And the next time a bid comes up from that particular or that same organization or a similar organization, I might be much less likely to bid. And I think in the long run, if we allow that environment to prevail when it comes to government contracting, what you'll see is folks like Mrs. Biondo or other organizations simply drop out of the process and decide that if I don't know what the rules are in advance, if I'm going to waste all my time and my money to go through these multiple rounds of bidding, then I'm not going to do it. And I think in the long term, that may have a detrimental effect on the price the taxpayer ultimately pays. Everybody up here, and you and I know each other very well, are interested in seeing the best deal for the taxpayer. But I also think there's a long-term consideration over the system that we create, as opposed to looking at everything as a one-off kind of deal. I think start with my questions, and then maybe we can come back and throw it open for further discussion. I want to start with, we'll just go in order. Mr. Hare, you had mentioned that there were no rules on subcontracting by small business to large businesses. There were no safe harbors. There were no. It was done on a case-by-case basis. As someone who used to practice law, I can tell you that the world of a case-by-case basis is the world in which the lawyers thrive. We love that kind of thing because it simply drives litigation. Give me some suggestions when we talk about that world of small businesses subcontracting to larger businesses, which we know not only happens but has to happen in certain circumstances. Give us some suggestions for safe harbor rules that you'd like to see.
The two biggest challenges, and you probably are all aware, but how this typically comes up is through the bid protest process. So a competitor will protest a bid of another contractor who is the apparent awardee on the basis that the business relationship between a small prime contractor and one of its subcontractors who happens to be a large business is in violation of SBA's affiliation rules. So a lot of the reason why there is a basis for the protest is because of allegations related to the bonding relationships that are utilized in the project. The prime contractor is required on nearly every federal project. I think Mark would say every federal project, to his Miller Act point, about making sure that you post a bond. And oftentimes the size of the small business set-aside project is so large that the subcontractor may be looked for to provide some assistance in the form of maybe an indemnification or things like that to help the small business subcontractor provide the bond. AGC's view and our view, my view is, that is not something that in and of itself should be improper. You have to look at other things, and I think you could develop a set of rules where that is something that is specifically permitted. For example, in the mentor-protege program, allowing the mentor to help support the bonding program of the protege is specifically allowed and often included. And I think it helps build a level of relationship for the small business that it can develop with its surety that in some cases is very helpful. But that is a very heavily litigated area right now in this type of work. Another example of a safe harbor that I think would be useful is some kind of clear rule on whether or not different parties can utilize employees of different companies. Just some clarity, so that everybody is playing by the same set of rules, because different competitors will choose to do different things related to how they get labor and executives onto a contractor's staff. And if one contractor is because of the absence of rules, is doing something and another contractor is not, that often can make the difference as to who gets the job based on competitiveness and a whole range of factors. And I guess my last point, the reason why this has become such an issue is because the Small Business Act has a provision in it that says if you misuse the goals of the small business program, you potentially are subject to False Claims Act liability. And there's no clear guidance on what is and isn't an improper practice relative to the small business rules. And we're starting to see both offices of inspector generals and, in some cases, U.S. attorneys who are taking a look at what we think are legitimate business practices and taking a different view of that and saying that's improper. And now all of a sudden you've got investigations ongoing with a lack of clarity as to what is permitted.
And by the way, to the next panelists, and Mr. West hit on this. A lot of times, what we'd rather see is a back and forth between folks from the private sector and the folks from the SBA and the GSA. So, to the extent the next panel is in place, I'd encourage you to listen as we go through all of these questions, but specifically these, because what we'd like you to do is respond specifically to things such as these recommendations that the request that Mr. Hare just made. Let's talk about bundling for a second, because I was surprised when you get down into the weeds of bundling. One of the It's not a loophole, but it's a gray area in the law that essentially removes, or could be determined to remove, new construction from the prohibitions on bundling. Tell us a little bit why that is and how you think we can fix that.
Well, I'm not exactly sure why that is.
The definitional issues.
Well, AGC, and I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to answer your question the way you want it, but for lack of understanding on my part. But I think AGC's view is that there are a variety of contracting vehicles that are used by the federal government, and several of the panelists here have touched on the bundling issue. We think that bundling in general, as long as you, I think what I heard Mr. Galarraza say is that perhaps you could take a series of smaller projects which could be placed in an IDIQ or a multiple award vehicle, and as long as you set those aside for small businesses, that even though that's technically bundling, it wouldn't hurt small businesses, is perhaps the way to say it. And the flip side of that is what AGC looks at are these larger multiple award contract vehicles where maybe you're taking $500 million down in New Orleans and you're sticking it into a multiple award vehicle, and only large businesses are going to qualify for that, even though you may have 50 projects that could come out of that in a per project average size of $5 to $10 million. And I think the concern is if you're taking that type of bundling and sticking it into a vehicle, it does hurt small businesses and
bundling
opportunities.
is a many splendored thing, it seems sometimes. One of the issues that we came across in one of our field hearings was that new construction, there's a prohibition on bundling in many circumstances, but because of the way the language is written, new construction is often excluded from that prohibition, so that you are allowed to bundle contracts on new construction that oftentimes effectively remove small businesses from allowing to bid, which leads me to my next question, because one of the things we heard both in California and in South Carolina when Ms. Chu and I conducted our field hearings was frustration over the amount of contract work that stayed local. The example I remember from my district was a $103 million project, of which less than $200,000 actually went to local businesses. Now, you mentioned during your testimony that generally you're concerned about a local preference, that you think it might have a negative impact. Tell me why that is, and tell me your thoughts generally on local preferences.
The concern with local preferences and many other preferences often is the reduction in competition and the price pressures that naturally occurs as a result of that. I mean, it's taking the flip side. I was in Puerto Rico at an AGC meeting last month, and the Puerto Rico AGC constantly is concerned about the fact that the larger mainland United States contractors come down there and compete in Puerto Rico for GSA projects, Corps of Engineers projects, things like that. It's sometimes a challenging set of circumstances to balance, cost with the desire to provide more opportunity for local businesses, and I think sometimes there's a tension there.
There is, and certainly, again, as Mr. Hanna said, and I think as everybody in this panel agrees, we're interested in getting the best deal for the taxpayers in both the short run and the long run, to the extent that's possible. But and I can't remember if it was your testimony or Mr. McCallum's, that one of the things we struggle with in the construction business generally is the attempts to commoditize a product, recognizing that it is not a commodity product. The construction in California is different from construction in South Carolina. And that sometimes, maybe, under limited circumstances that could still protect the taxpayer, I do want to continue to explore the possibility of looking at local preferences. But we'll deal with that as it comes. Ms. McCallum, you talked about the size standard, which listen, we ran a small business that had very high revenues with very few number of people because we were able to subcontract out a lot of our business. You build houses, you can do that. Plus, if you're selling something that sells for a relatively large amount of money, regardless of the size of the profit margins, if you measure by revenue, you might be large, and you measure by number of employees, you might be small. But so while I share your concern and I sympathize with you to a certain extent, tell me how to deal with the other circumstance, where I might be a business that sells something that doesn't cost very much, but employs a large number of people, and that's why we run this, because we want to treat them as a small business as well. So help us walk that fine line between counting something that is a small business as a large business and vice versa.
Well, in construction, what we find is a great deal of our money is spent on material, subcontractors, equipment. So if you actually look at the size of a company, is it valued by their gross revenues, their net income? How are you really looking at that? There's not a clear definition as why they're looking at the top revenue. So if you were to look at what I actually expend in labor, that might be a better indicator of, and if you were allowed to maybe exclude out your material and subcontractors, because this is work that was actually performed by your own forces. So it would perform a commercial useful function in the construction industry. That would make sense to me. But to just say that because you do $7 million a year, you're a big business, I don't understand that. I don't think it makes sense when other companies can do $100 million and still be considered small because they had an employee count of less than 1,500 people. So how can someone who has 1,500 people still be considered small? But I'm just going to use my own company's example. If I do more than $14 million, I am not considered small, and I have less than 500 people. I can't understand that.
We struggle with it as well. As somebody who used to be in the private sector and then ended up on this committee, I was stunned to find out that not only do we do that, but we change the definition from industry to industry. So while we're here today talking about generally construction industry, that there's a different measure for what's small within pharmaceuticals versus construction versus transportation. So we sympathize with you, and I can assure you we're trying to figure out a way to bring some reason to that system as well. Talk to me about retainage. Again, a circumstance where I'm sympathetic to what the plight that you brought to us today, because I've been on your side of contracts. I've also been on the other side of the contracts, and I found retainage to be a really, really good way to make sure the job gets finished. And while your claim is correct that I could, as the owner or as the prime contractor, I could always turn to the bond, I could assure you it was much easier to make sure you finish the job by keeping at least a little bit of retainage. So how do we balance that?
Well, as you know, it would be difficult to give you all the different scenarios in our testimony because there was a lot of controversy in regards to the retainage. But the retainage, we understand when you're a general. And
by the way, am I using, because we called it retainage, it's called retention, and are we talking about the same thing?
Yes.
Good, thank you very much.
Yes.
All right.
You know, in a lot of instances when you work in the private sector, if you are performing a large contract and you go back to your general contractor and say, hey, you know, I am just about done with this job, can you reduce my retention by 5%? Or at the 50% mark, you know, is it necessary for you to continue to hold 10%? Most of the time in the private sector, your owner will come back and say, hey, yes, you're doing a great job. I'll reduce your retention. If you're not doing a good job, obviously they're going to hold your retention. So the problem is, how do you do this with the federal government so it's clear? And the way the rules currently read, it says they don't have to charge that. Well, look at it from another perspective. Business isn't all that great for most contractors these days. At the end of the day, on their financial statement, maybe they might make 1%, okay? If you're holding 10% of that project until 6, 7 months after a job is completed, you have officially become that company's bank for them because they've had to go and borrow the money before they get that last 10% of their job.
Well, when I dealt with retention, it was simply until the work was completed on the contract, not the overall job was completed.
Well,
So that circumstance I could see would be a problem, but how could it, if I'm the owner and you're the contractor, how could you object to me withholding 10% until the final piece of work on your contract is finished?
okay, so say you finished your job in September,
Mm-hmm.
and the entire project is finished in September, all scopes,
Okay.
and you don't get paid for a whole year because the owner does not choose to pay you for a whole year.
Okay, maybe we're talking about something else. To me, that would be a breach of the contract. But I see what you're saying.
But again,
let me ask you one
okay.
more question, then we'll move on, which is bid shopping, because it's something that I struggle with as well. I don't care for it. My state has banned it. Several states have banned it. What is the experience within the industry? Have the state bans? I think there's 10 or 12 states that have done it. Has that proved successful? Have we managed to solve this problem in the states that have banned bid shopping?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Neither do I.
Okay.
So, very quickly, I have, early on in the process, Mr. McCallum, or early on this year, I became aware of some of the issues that deal with surety bonds through something that happened back in my district and spent a little bit of time getting up to speed on the issue, only to find that Mr. Hanna had already done a considerable amount of work on it. So I'd like at this point to yield 4 minutes to Mr. Hanna to ask questions of Mr. McCallum specifically on H.R. 3534.